Hi everyone, I'm Hanobi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I will be the host for this webinar. Today, we'll be going over responding to male victims and survivors on your tribal college campus. Joining us today is Lenny Hayes. Before we get started, I just want to inform everyone who may not know that Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at honovi@red-wind.net. Joining us today is, once again, Lenny Hayes. Lenny is an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. He is the owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. He has an extensive training in mental and chemical health issues that impact the Two-Spirit and LGBTQ community. He has always worked within the Native American community, which includes the American Indian Family Center, St. Paul, the Sakapi community, and he was also a consultant and therapist with the Little Earth of United Tribes. He is currently in private practice specializing in Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ issues with adults and youth. And his lived experience and training has made him a sought-after workshop presenter on Native American historical and intergenerational trauma and how it impacts the Native American community, as well as the Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ individual and community. And I will now turn it over to him.
Thank you, Hanovi. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Today, we will be talking about responding to male victim survivors on your tribal campuses. So, I'm going to do a small introduction. Okay, I think my screen is locked. Okay, so who am I? So my name is Tukawanaki Luta, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes. I am from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I am founder and owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. I am a mental and chemical health therapist. I specialize in marriage family therapy. I'm an educator, an advocate. I'm also a motivational speaker. I'm also, in my language, I identify as a Winkta, which was the word that was given to me by my people, but I also identify as a Dakota Two-Spirit male. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse and adult rape. I'm also a survivor of child mental and physical abuse, and I'm also a survivor of the foster care system. So before we get started, I do want to discuss a little bit about what it means to be Two-Spirit. And also, too, I would like to pre-warn all attendees that once we start getting into the PowerPoint presentation, I will be talking about the different forms of sexual abuse. And also we'll be talking about the impact of sexual violence on individuals, specifically males. So I really want to encourage that if you need to step away from your computer for a few minutes, please do, because I really want you to take care of yourself, because when we talk about sexual violence, it can be very impacting on an individual, especially if you are a survivor of sexual violence. So I really want to encourage you all to take a step away from your computer if you need to. And then also one of the things that I also wanted to state too is that we know that sexual violence happens in all communities, in all genders. And one of the things that I really express when doing this presentation is that I'm specifically talking about the Native American community, because when we talk about sexual violence against men and boys, we do not specifically talk about it within our Native communities, and we know that we have a lot of male survivors in our community, and yet they have not yet come forward to identify that they are a survivor. So again, I just really want to encourage everyone to take care of themselves. So what does it mean to be two-spirit? So the term two-spirit comes from the Ojibwe language. And what it means is that the individual houses both a male and female spirit. Male two-spirits were considered to be a third gender. So how we would view that is, so the first gender would be the heterosexual male. The second gender would be the female heterosexual. The third gender would be the male who identifies as two-spirit. And the fourth gender would be the female who identifies as two-spirit. So the term two-spirit came about in 1990 at the third annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay Lesbian Conference in Winnipeg. So what happened was a group of individuals who identified as Native, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals came together, and they basically, from my understanding, wanted to take a step back from the mainstream language. And so we know that there is over 577 tribes today, with over 200 languages in our tribal communities. And so they basically wanted to come up with one word, and that's where the term two-spirit came about. There's important things to remember about the two-spirit word, meaning that it's a universal term that's used across different tribal communities across the country, but also to remember that there are some tribes in the United States who do not connect with the word two-spirit. When I said earlier, so for me, when I talk about my identity, and in order for me to sort of understand and take a step back from that colonized way of thinking, I will first identify as a Winkta first, because that was the word that was given to me by my people. Second, I will call myself a two-spirit male. And then lastly, I will call myself a gay male. So it is said that when a person is given the gift of being two-spirit, it means that that individual has the ability to see the world in two different perspectives at the same time. Research shows when Will Roscoe went into tribal communities to collect information in regards to individuals who identified as two-spirit, he documented that there were over 130 tribes in every region of North America among every type of native culture. Here are some cultural terms to identify and also gender. So if you look on your left side where it says the tribe, then term, and then gender, on your left side of the screen, you have 4 different tribes. And in the middle is the word. So for instance, like the Crow, the Navajo, and the Lakota, and the Zuni. So in the Lakota language, we would say Winkte, and that would identify as a male. There's also a female word in the Lakota language in regards to females. The Navajo people, they use the word Natle, which means male and female. So there are tribes with one specific word that will identify both male and female gender. It is very important to remember that genders vary from tribe to tribe but are similar. It is also said that some tribes have up to 15 genders to identify two-spirit individuals. It's also important to remember that the term two-spirit is a Native American concept and should only be used by Native Americans who identify. So now I'm going to begin to talk about sexual violence against men and boys. So as part of my training, and I really do enjoy doing this training in person, just basically because it's something that we don't talk about in our tribal communities. But I also like to engage conversation when talking about sexual violence against men and boys. So I usually like to impose these questions on individuals when I'm doing a specific training. And I like to ask the question, so how many of you know of a male boy or an adult who have been impacted by sexual violence? If so, what were some of your struggles and challenges? How did you respond? Um, and it's really important that you ask yourself these questions because, again, you may have your own biases in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. Often, sometimes we only think that females or women are impacted by sexual violence, but men and boys are also impacted just because of our own stigma. And, and I'm gonna get more into it once we get more into the webinar. One of the things that I like to talk about with this picture, we all know what this picture is. This is the Carlisle boarding school, the first Native American boarding school in Pennsylvania. And so if you look at all the children in this picture, so statistics tells us today that 1 out of 10 individuals may identify as either lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. In my Two-Spirit training, what I specifically talk about is that before colonization, Two-Spirit people were treated with the utmost respect and honor before colonization. History also tells us also that the Europeans and missionaries actually were coming into our tribal communities and murdering people who identified as Two-Spirit. So one of the things that I talk about also is that our people loved us so much, our leaders in our communities loved us so much, but loved us so much that they actually hit us because of what was happening to us. But because of colonization, they also have forgotten about us. So when you look at this picture, you know, if you can imagine, some of these children may have identified, and in some tribal communities, they actually had ceremonies and celebrations for children who basically were coming out. So it wasn't frowned upon to be Two-Spirit. But one of the things that I also like to remind people also too is that before colonization, I would say almost every tribe um, in the country had a specific word that they used to identify someone like me, for instance. So again, the word in my language is winkta. So that was the word that was given to me. Because of colonization, that word was lost in a lot of the tribes. And so if you want to do your own research, if you're Native American, I would go back and talk with your elders in your community and ask them specifically if there was a word given to someone who identifies as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ today. So here are a lot of issues that impacts Two-Spirit LGBTQ individuals and community, loss of Native identity, loss of culture. So in my work, and specifically working with individuals who identify, so as part of my practice, I've always worked within Native community in regards to doing therapy with individuals. But in the last 5 or 6 years, in my own practice, I will specifically only work with individuals, both youth and adults, who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ because of the lack of resources for these individuals. A lot of our own therapists do not know how to work with individuals who identify. So I felt there was a huge need. As a marriage family therapist, I've also worked with families who had a child who may identified, which is quite rewarding, but also sometimes could have been, or could be a real struggle because again, if we're not checking our own biases, then we don't, properly nurture or there's a lot of shame that's put on these individuals who identify. So those are a lot of things to think about. So these are a lot of the issues that really impacts this community. Here in Minneapolis, I actually, several years back, I advocated really strongly in a Two-Spirit support group. And so a lot of these issues that I'm talking about is not only in research, but also in fact with my own experience in working with individuals who identify. A lot of our individuals who identify come from the reservation to the bigger city, and a lot of them have that loss of Native identity, meaning that within their own tribal communities, a lot of them were shunned. A lot of them experienced loss of culture, meaning that they weren't allowed to go into ceremony. And those are two of the biggest issues that have really impacted individuals that I've worked with personally and professionally in a therapeutic setting. One of the things that we also know of what is happening today also is the sexual assaults that are unreported. Now, I would say 95% of the individuals that I worked with, both male and female, have disclosed of being sexually assaulted, sexually abused as children. One of the things that we know is happening right now too is the sex and human trafficking of individuals who identify. So I attended a webinar earlier this year through the National Missing and Murdered Exploited Children Network, along with another organization. And in their presentation, they stated that 51% of gay males are being trafficked, which was really astonishing to me when I first heard that, because, you know, in most of our tribal communities, we mainly talk about girls or women who are being trafficked. So one of the things that I know of in that presentation is that they didn't break down by ethnicity in regards to individuals who are being trafficked, males. Um, and we know that sometimes the proper questions aren't being asked in regards to males who may come forward, gay males who come forward and say that they're being trafficked. So we don't know quite the percentage of gay Native males who are being trafficked. So again, these are a lot of issues that are really impacting our community. I wanted to present this so it sort of gives you an idea of some of the struggles and challenges that we have. But also too, I really want to remind people that as part of my work in doing this work in regards to talking about sexual violence against men and boys is breaking down the stigma. Most individuals believe that males who are impacted by sexual violence identify as gay, and that is not true. Um, so in my work, what I'm trying to do is break down that stigma so that we can begin to have more conversation. Also, in before COVID, I was traveling across the country in different tribal communities, specifically talking about this topic, sexual violence against men and boys, and have come to meet male individuals who have disclosed that they were sexually abused by children. So again, that's thinking about like the unreported sexual violence that's happening. The only research that was ever done on Two-Spirit people in regards to violence was the Honors Project. This project was done through Dr. Karina Walters out of the University of Washington. And what her team did was they went into the 6 largest urban Two-Spirit communities and collected this data. Now, this data we know is old data. So when I talk with my colleagues about this data, we believe that this data is much more higher today. This is the only research that was ever specifically done on violence against Two-Spirit people. And you know, the statistics are astonishing if you look at Two-Spirit versus heterosexual. The only thing that I don't like about this research was the fact that they didn't go into tribal communities to collect this data. It was mainly the urban communities. Even though we know that a lot of our Two-Spirit people who live on the reservation often migrated to the bigger city, believing that there was more resources that could help them. But in reality, a lot of the LGBTQ organizations did not specifically know how to work with individuals who identify as Native LGBTQ or Two-Spirit. So now I'm going to begin to talk about what is sexual violence. So when a person uses tricks or power or violence to have sexual contact with another adult, it is called rape or sexual assault. When the individual is a victim of a relative, people often use the phrase incest. When the child is a victim of an adult, it's called child molestation. What is sexual abuse? Sexual abuse is sexual contact without consent. One of the things to really remember is that children do not consent because they often do what adults tell them to do. A child is affected by sexual abuse when he may question his ability to defend himself or may not trust his body to function in times of crisis. He may question his body and say, what did I do to invite this? He may begin to hate his body. He may begin to not respect his body or the surroundings around him, will often lead to use of alcohol, drugs, over or under eating, and smoking as a teen. A child is affected by sexual abuse when he disassociates as a child due to memories or reminders of the abuse. Even after the abuse stops, the child may feel he is ineffective, powerless, or worthless. He will continue to question himself, why did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? Or why didn't I tell someone? So often, when we think about our tribal communities, we know that in a lot of our tribal communities and in families, there's a lot of dysfunction that's happening. So a child may not have the proper or trusted adults around him or her to tell someone about what's happening to them. And often a lot of times, small children, again, will do what they're told, and will often be afraid to tell because of the threats that are being said to them. So that's something to really think about. When a boy is sexually abused by a woman, the boy faces confusion and isolation. Um, a boy who talks about being abused by a woman is often greeted by disbelief, denial, trivializing, and romancing his story, faced with society's perception that he may try to fit in and begins to brag or joke about what happened to him. If any of the experiences felt good, he was not abused. If he did not enjoy it, he must be gay. So one of the things that we talk about too in regards to sexual violence against boys who are being sexually abused by males is one of the things that we don't talk about. And it happens with adult males too who have been raped. Often sometimes we may have that the response of having an erection or even ejaculating from the rape. And so that causes a lot of mass confusion in individuals because when that happens, they believe that, oh, I must be gay. But in reality, when our body is aroused, we don't have control of what's happening. So we don't talk enough about the development of our bodies. So what pieces of childhood does a sexually abused child lose? Now, again, I'm specifically talking about boys, but again, this may also impact girls also. So when we go into a circular movement, often what happens is there's a loss of memory of childhood. In my own experience as being a survivor of child sexual abuse, I don't have a lot of memories of my childhood, meaning that I get really frustrated sometimes because I can't remember the good memories of my childhood. One of the childhood memories that I hold on to is that when I was part of the foster care system, I was allowed to go and stay with my grandmother on the weekends. And one of the things that I remember about my grandmother was that she would cook these huge breakfasts. And so today, when I smell bacon, it reminds me of my grandmother because I can still see her today as an adult standing in the kitchen making a lot of food because she would make these huge breakfasts and then she would make fry bread. And so but when I smell bacon, it's a good memory for me to remember my grandmother. Lots of opportunity to play. So a lot of times, you know, in my work as a mental health provider and working with Native American people, one of the things that I really work with them is healing the child within, because we know that because of a lot of dysfunction that happens within our tribal communities, our tribal families, is that there's a lot of dysfunction, meaning there's abuse, there's alcohol use, drug use, sexual abuse. So often a child who grows up in that situation never is allowed to be a child. Um, so they lose that opportunity to play. So today when I work with Native individuals, that is one piece that I work on with them, is working on healing that child within. Because a lot of times, I mean, if you think about it, sometimes we often have Native adults around us who will say, don't act like that to a child, or that's childish. And those are not good things to say to children, because you're not allowing them to be children. So a lot of them grow up with a lot of shame, um, loss of healthy social contact, loss of opportunity to learn, the loss of control of one's body, loss of normal, loving, nurturing environment, and other losses. So these are just some examples of losses that children, and specifically in talking about in this webinar, is males. So this is a lot of things that are lost by children. Um, did you know that the losses that boys and men experience in their early years leave lifelong scars and pain? Boys who do not fit the traditional macho image are marginalized, ostracized, harassed, and physically punished. Bullying also results in trauma. Um, the trauma that males experience is lethal, large, and hard to work through, but it is possible. Many men who have hurt others may have been hurt themselves. Here are some facts. So 75 to 95% of offenders are known and may be related to the child. In development terms, young children cannot make up explicit sexual information. They must be exposed to it and speak their own experiences. Sometimes parents will try to get their child to lie. So in my experience in working with individuals, I've heard a lot of stories often that adults around a child will often say, if you get taken away, it's your fault. Or if he or she goes to jail, it's your fault. So a lot of the adults in our families will often say this to children, so children do not come forward and tell. Um, Most child sexual abuse is perpetrated by men who are heterosexual and do not find sex with other men at all attractive. I know a lot of people, when they first read that or hear that, they get really like they can't believe it. But there is enough research that was done in regards to that, that most men who perpetrate on children or other boys or men are not gay. Um, Children generally do not question the behavior of adults. They are often coerced by bribes, threats, and use of authority. Um, One of the things to remember is that child abuse is an act of power by which an adult uses a child. Abuse is abuse. A woman abusing a child is still a child abuser. Um, in a recent study, of convicted child molesters, 80% were found to have committed their first offense before the age of 30. So at the end of this webinar, I will be sharing some resources with you if anyone is interested in reading more about sexual violence against men and boys. One thing that I can tell you right now is that there's not a lot of research that's done here in the United States in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. So a lot of the studies that I have read in that topic have been from other countries. I know Norway is a country that does a lot of research and study on sexual violence against men and boys. My hope is that here in the United States that we will begin to um, do more research and data in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. So after talking, I just discussed the impact of sexual abuse or sexual violence on boys. Now I'm going to move into the impact of child sexual abuse on adult males. Because, the reason why I talk about this too is because a lot of our adult males go to our tribal colleges. And one of the things that I talk about in doing this work is that when a individual, either male or female, who are impacted by sexual violence, if they haven't received a space to be able to work through what happened to them, a lot of them will go to college to escape from being at home, but a lot of them don't have that energy to put into their studies. And so a lot of them fail college. I am, I disclose and tell my own personal story to help people to understand. I remember my first tribal college experience, I struggled with it because of a lot of the trauma that I carried into my adulthood that I didn't have an opportunity to work through. So I really struggled with trying to go to college. So one of the reasons why I'm saying this is just to help people to understand, it is difficult to try to go to college if you haven't worked through a lot of your own personal issues. So one of the things that I share in regards to sexual violence against men and boys, specifically men, this was the only research that was done in the United States. You can find this research through the National Institute of Justice, and this is Violence Against American Indian, Alaska Native Women and Men. This is their 2010 findings. And in that research, it states that 1 in 4 American Indian and Alaskan Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. More than 1 in 10 have experienced sexual violence with penetration. So overall, they're saying that 475,000 American Indian and Alaskan Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. Now, I believe that these statistics are much more higher, basically because I know of a lot of men who did not report being sexually abused as children or even being raped as an adult. What I also know of too is that often individuals, advocates, are very uncomfortable with working with men who have been raped. I usually like to tell the example of an advocate from North Dakota who reached out to me. And one of the reasons why she reached out to me was that she was going to be working with a male that was raped by another male. And so the first question she asked me was, how do I work with him? My response to her question was, well, you would work with him the same way that you would work with a woman, with a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy. So through our conversation, and by the time we had ended our call, she realized that one of the things that she needed to work through was her own biases in regards to men or boys being impacted by sexual violence. So it's often good to go through that journey of like understanding your own self when working with individuals, because again, we often think it's only girls and women who are impacted by sexual violence. We never really think of men and boys who've been impacted. So what I did was I broke down the research. So I compared the types of violence against men versus the American Indian and Alaska Native males versus non-Hispanic and white-only individuals. So if you look on the left side of the column in the red, the statistics in the many different types of violence that occurs on men and boys are specifically this: men is much more higher than the right side. So these statistics alone just really blow me away. But it's important to see this so that we know that this is happening within our communities. Here is the type of violence in a past year. Again, if you look at the statistics on the left side versus the right side, it's much more higher. Again, we don't talk about this. A lot of men carry shame in regards to being sexually violated as children, or even talking about being raped as an adult, just because of a lot of stigma, which I will go into more in further slides. Here are some of the frequent issues and problems faced by adult survivors of sexual child abuse. There's a lot, individuals experience anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, guilt and shame. Often they blame themselves and put in situations, fear of who they're going to tell, or what if they do tell? Will the perpetrator come after them? Often, sometimes, and I am honest about this, but some of them also fear becoming abusers, or they become protectors. So also too, as part of the stigma of sexual violence against men and boys, is that often one of the things I've heard too in tribal communities, or just talking with my own family or talking with other individuals, is that when someone experiences sexual violence as a child or even as an adult, who may identify as a gay male or bisexual or two-spirit male, there is stigma on them that that's the reason why they're gay, bisexual, or two-spirit. That is not true. So that's one of the things I also talk about too when I do trainings on sexual violence against men and boys, is to help people to understand that it's not only these individuals. That doesn't not define who they are. So for me, when I publicly speak about being a survivor of sexual violence, I always tell people that my sexual violence that occurred with me as a child and as a young adult does not define who I am today. I am a two-spirit male. I was born this way. So I like to remind people of that. Here are some other issues and problems that are faced by adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Does not know how to trust. That's a huge thing. So you may have a male student who may have been impacted by sexual violence and has a hard time trusting other adults around him. He does not know how to communicate. So again, a lot of these issues also impacts relationships. And that is why sometimes we see, and I'm not saying every individual that has these issues were impacted by sexual violence. So I really want to stress that. But this just gives you something to think about. They also do not know how to communicate in a healthy and effective way. A lot of times, one of the things I always say is that the behaviors that we do that are dysfunctional, when we come from a dysfunctional home, are learned behaviors. But when I work with individuals, one of the things that I say to them, because a lot of them are really hard on themselves because of their learned behaviors, but one of the things that I say to them to bring them hope is that learned behaviors can also become changed behaviors. And it's really important to say that to individuals, because a lot of times we are impacted by our own behaviors, our own learned behaviors. There may be something that we don't like about ourselves, but if you learned it as a child, that's a learned behavior. A lot of our young people who are male, who are impacted by sexual violence, may have alcohol and drug issues. Often, sometimes they will also have a sexual addiction. Um, Confusion, does not know how to love. So social isolation, that's another impact of sexual violence. So again, these are a lot of things for you to think about when, because you may have a person, young adult, young male adult, who may come to you and say, this is what happened to me. So I do this to help people to understand how to sit and talk with individuals who are impacted by sexual violence. We should never, place judgment. We should never force someone to tell us that they were sexually abused. Instead, we should create a safe space for them to tell their stories. It is also important to know that not all issues and problems are the same with all adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Each individual is different with similarities. So again, that's really important to know that. That goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, when I talked about the frequent issues, each issue is different. I also want to remind people too that people who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ may not have all the same issues. So again, I don't want to put labels on people, and I don't want you to put labels on people, but just to give you an understanding of what happens to this community, and also survivors of sexual violence. Why do men wait to seek professional help? The abuse could still be too fresh. It may not yet been defined as abuse. Again, we may see it as an abuse, but we need the individual who's coming forward to say that they were abused. And again, we don't force them to come forward, or we don't force them to say that about themselves, because again, they're probably carrying so much shame, so much fear about coming forward and saying it. So we need to create a safe space for them. The perpetrator may still got you to keep silent. So one of the things that I've seen in tribal communities, and in one specific event, I was presenting for a board in North Dakota, and a husband came with his wife to the event. And one of the things that he asked me when I was doing that training was, what am I supposed to do when I go out into tribal communities and my perpetrator was a spiritual person within the community? And when he was telling me these things, he became very teary-eyed. Right then and there, I couldn't stop and do therapy with him. But one of the things that I said to him, the first thing I said to him was, I believe you. And we should always say that to individuals who come forward and talk about or say they were abused. We should tell them that we believe them, because that validates them. Second, I said, I am happy that you didn't act on your rage, because one of the things he said was every time he sees this individual who abused him as a child, the anger and rage goes to the top of his neck. So what I said to him was, I'm happy and glad that you didn't act on your rage. And then lastly, what I said to him was that I hope that he could find someone who he feels safe with to work through his abuse. And so those are some of the examples that you may get an individual, a male, who may come forward and want to talk with you. This is what you should do with them. They also have a fear, even though the abuse may be over, it can still feel dangerous. Even a dead perpetrator's presence can be felt strongly with a survivor. The time and place may not be right to disclose. The individual may not know that he has options. Feelings of being weak, battered, and hopeless to take action. Self-blame may keep individual from seeking professional help. Like, for instance, well, maybe I should have never drank and this would never happen. That's just an example. Often survivors of sexual violence will often blame themselves. Well, maybe I should never went there, or maybe I should never done this, as examples. Shame. Again, there's so much shame in our tribal communities when we talk about male sexual violence. So a lot of them are fearful of coming forward and talking about their own experience. So as part of this training, I know I went through this really quickly. So again, I do this training in person, and I usually do a training from 5 to 6 hours, because what I like to do is create a lot of conversation, because we are uncomfortable when we talk about sexual violence, especially about males, male survivors. So in my trainings, I like to do a lot of questions and answers. Because this is a webinar, I'm not able to do that. So I kind of feel like when I present on this, I go through this really quickly. And my hope is that however many who are attending the webinar today, I'm hoping that I can help you feel comfortable enough to ask questions. So in this slide, one of the questions that I like to ask is, how do we help males in tribal college settings? So again, you all who are here today are being educated and given the awareness of sexual violence against men and boys, specifically the Native population. So that's one of the first steps. Second, breaking down the stigma. Talking about that it's not only males who may identify as two-spirit or gay or bisexual are not the only individuals who experience sexual violence. Heterosexual males also experience sexual violence. So breaking down the stigma, um, just saying it in the fact that, it's not only this population that gets impacted by sexual violence, but it happens to all males. I don't like putting my population in a box, because one of the things that, again, like I said earlier, I am a male. Even though I identify as a two-spirit male, even though I identify as a Winkta, I am still a male who was impacted by sexual violence. Often, sometimes we also believe that males who may identify as two-spirit or bisexual or gay, um, often we have men who are males who are feminine. Um, so again, we say, oh, they were raped because they acted like a woman. You know, that kind of language and that kind of talk needs to be stopped, because if that individual identifies as a male, that individual is a male that was impacted by sexual violence. It doesn't matter, um, your mannerisms. Um, we should enter this when talking with individuals with a lot of compassion and empathy. Um, one of the things I talk about within tribal communities is that we need to go back to what our culture or what our values teach us within our community. So within my community, I hold strong in, when I work with people, to show them a lot of compassion, show them a lot of understanding, because it's difficult coming forward and talking about the experience of sexual violence or any other form of violence. Create a safe place to tell their story, meaning that, in your office, make it safe for them. Um, Let them know that whatever they tell you is confidential. Um, again, goes back to all of these things intertwined together, compassion, empathy, um, kindness, understanding, check your own biases. Again, what I said earlier, if you really believe that males don't experience this, then you got your own personal work to do. Um, Proper referral. Now, you know, um, you can show compassion and kindness by just sitting with the individual. But if you need to make referral to a mental health provider, make the proper referral. Often sometimes, a lot of people, like I tell my clients when I work with them, it's okay for you to ask me questions like, do you have specific training in working with individuals who may experienced some form of sexual violence? What is your experience working with individuals with trauma? Have you worked with individuals who identify as Native? Um, have you worked with individuals who identify as LGBTQ or Two-Spirit? Those are the proper questions to ask when making a referral, because it's really important. Um, what I have seen in like the bigger urban areas like here in Minneapolis, a lot of the Native organizations have an elder at large because often individuals feel much more comfortable talking with an elder versus maybe somebody who's a mental health provider. Now, through my own healing journey, I always compare and let people know that the Western way of healing and thinking has its purpose, but I will also connect with the elder within my community. And because again, as being a survivor of many things, I will often do check-ins within myself. So I will go and see a mental health provider, and then I will also see an elder to bring balance. Um, so for me, that's helpful. Um, and so these are some really important things to remember when working with males or any individual that's been impacted by sexual violence. I know one of the things that we don't also talk about too is transgender individuals, because we do have males to females, females to males. Females to males are the ones who identify as male, but they were born a female. Um, and they, I know there's a huge issue within the transgender community in regards to this population being raped. So my encouragement to all of you is to really educate yourselves about sexual violence on any individuals, but this specifically today is talking about the male population. Again, this is a population that we do not talk about. We don't know how to help them. We don't know how to ask the proper questions. So my hope is that even though this was a short webinar, that you have some understanding. My hope is that if you have any questions or concerns that you don't want to ask here, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is at the beginning of the slides. So here are some of the resources that I have read in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. The first one is a link to PBS Frontline. PBS Frontline was the first, this is the first documentary, Predator on a Reservation, that was ever done in regards to sexual violence against Native males. This documentary is very powerful. It will get you angry. So if you choose to watch it, go to PBS Frontline, click on their documentaries, and then type in Predator on a Reservation, and it will come up. When I say that it's very powerful and it makes you angry, is because of just, some of the males who are in this documentary talk about their experiences being sexually violated, and it's really sad, and it will get you angry. I will admit that, because the first time I seen it, I walked away halfway through it because I needed to take a break because I got really angry. But it was also very, very educational. I use this documentary when I do trainings in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. So here's some other books to read too. Again, there's not a lot of research and data out there in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. There is research out there, but a lot of my own education has come from reading, but also my own experience being a survivor of sexual violence. Here's again also some more resources that you can also take a look at. And I believe that Redwin will have this PowerPoint. So if you need to go back and look for resources, please do. And with that, I think we will open it up for questions or comments.
Alrighty, so if you have any questions, you can put it into the chat or the Q&A box, or if you would prefer, you can click the little hand icon to raise your hand, and we will allow you to speak it directly. And also, yes, this is recorded, so it will be up on our YouTube. So if anyone would like to rewatch it, they absolutely can. I'll give it just a few more seconds.
Did you find this to be helpful? Was it too quick? Are you nervous about asking questions? Because I really want to create a safe space for just, individuals to be able to feel comfortable about talking about sexual violence.
All right, if you have a question. You can go ahead and talk now. If you are speaking, we aren't able to hear you.
Do you know if she's trying to ask a question or whoever?
I believe so, because their mic is on, but I'm not sure if they're having technical difficulties. While they're figuring that out, we have a question in the chat. Are there any places we can go to get resources?
There is not a lot of resources out there in regards to sexual violence against men and boys, specifically within Native community. I do believe that there is some resources for non-Native individuals. So in doing this work, I'm hoping that the more that we begin to talk about this topic within our tribal communities, that resources will be developed. I know that there is individuals who are male, Native men, who are actually doing work within communities. Specifically, one that I always like to mention is a good friend of mine by the name of Greg Greycloud, who lives in Rosebud. He actually does equine therapy with male survivors, both boys and adults. One of the things that I also talk about too is that when we talk about this type of work, we should be leaning towards the survivors as being the experts rather than someone who hasn't experienced sexual violence, because when we hear personal stories of survival, it also gives us a better understanding, but also too, when survivors are speaking, they are the ones who are the experts who need to sort of tell people, higher officials or whatever about like what is needed to heal. So again, there's not a lot of resources out there. One of the things I also talk about too is like within tribal colleges, do not be afraid to do posters or campaigns in regards to sexual violence, not only to girls and women, but also to boys and men. Because I believe when a survivor sees that, that breaks down just a very small part of the wall for them to come forward to begin to talk about their own experience. They're not going to do it if they don't see it. When I do work in regards to Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ, specifically talking about shelters or any other offices, if I don't, in my own experience, when I went into organizations to work on specifically Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ issues, or anything specific to this population, one of the things that I will say to them is that when I go into an organization, I will look around first And if I don't see something that signifies that they work with individuals who may identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ, then that tells me that they don't. And so if you want to be helpful to this specific community, then you need to show that you are wanting to help them. It may just be like a little rainbow flag, or maybe um, maybe a sticker that says safe space. You know, there's many different things out there to signify, you know, that you're creating a safe space for individuals who identify. But again, you know, I don't like to put my population in a box. Go back and think about what I said earlier, is that, you know, our sexual orientation should not be the whole picture. I mean, if you have an individual who identifies as a male who's been impacted by sexual violence, then we should be saying that's a male. So.
All right. So the person who was wanting to speak put it into the chat. So it's a two-parter. Would a mom know at prenatal stage that she is having a gay child? And also, um, they're hearing that gay is a learned behavior from sexual abuse.
Oh gosh. Okay, first of all, there is no tests that can be done to identify if your child is gay. Um, Second, um, being gay is not a learned behavior, and it doesn't stem from sexual abuse. I know of individuals who identify as either gay, bisexual, transgender, who have never experienced sexual violence as a child, um, and that did not make them gay. You're born this way. Like I said earlier, I'm a two-spirit male. My sexual violence does not define who I am. My identity, I was born a two-spirit male. So it's really important to ask that question. I'm glad that you asked that question, because I feel like sometimes people are afraid to ask those questions, but I want to reassure you that um, what you're asking is not true. And I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think a lot of people are really fearful of asking questions.
Alrighty, do we have any more questions before we wrap up? Alrighty, fun. Thank you, Lenny,
Oh,
for
that's it.
hosting today.
There was another question that just
Oh,
came up. So how do we challenge myths about sexual violence and men in a tribal college setting? Well, again, I mean, like I said, you know, doing a campaign in the college, specifically talking about sexual violence against men and boys. Again, if we don't talk about those things, then individuals aren't going to come forward, or individuals are not going to feel safe about talking about their own experience. It doesn't mean that we're forcing them to come out and say that they were sexually abused, but knowing that they're in a safe space. Again, going back to what I said earlier, when I didn't work through my sexual violence and tried to go to college at a very young age, at 20 years old, um, I didn't put a lot of effort into my education because of my own trauma. I didn't have the ability to sit down and study. Um, Again, I don't want to put labels on people. So please, I mean, a lot of our young people have experienced many, many different things. So I don't want to say someone who is struggling with academic abilities um, is someone who was sexually abused or whatever. That is not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is just understanding the possibility of someone and what their own experience being sexually violated. So again, educating yourself about the impact of sexual violence on men and boys, and also girls and women. Um, and this work just started. I mean, we're still struggling just having the conversation about sexual violence against men and boys. It's like a hush hush thing in our tribal communities. Um, there's so much shame. Um, just people thinking that it's only individuals who identify as gay are the ones who are being sexually abused. That's not true. um, so and we have to again challenge our own biases. That's one of the most important pieces to remember, because we're not going to properly help someone if we have our own personal biases. We won't put a lot of energy into helping them. um, but I do have to say that across the country, um, in my conversation with individuals in tribal communities, they are wanting to have more conversation. Some of our women advocates are know that some of our men have experienced sexual violence, and they're wanting to open up conversation. They want trainings within their community. So there's good things that are happening. It just took a very long time for it to happen.
Anyone else have a question? Alrighty. Well, I would thank you, Lenny. Before we end the session, I want to inform everyone that you'll be getting a survey pop-up after the webinar ends, as well as over email by tomorrow. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. Coming up in the series, on October 15th, we have safety planning with sexual assault victims and survivors on tribal college campuses. And that is on October 15th, same time. And then on October 29th, we have peer support for student survivors of sexual assault. And that is also at the same time. And with that, I would like to thank our presenter, Lenny, our captioner, Mary, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.